It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to our 21st webinar, rather undiplomatically titled SAMUDRA MANTHAN, Does AUKUS Enhance the Quad or Undermine it? I do presume that the participants would be aware of this great epic tale from Hindu mythology. While the partnership of the Quad and now the alliance with AUKUS would surely churn the seas, will they produce the nectar of immortality and be a harbinger of peace, or would they poison its waters and raise the tensions that may well spiral out of control? Peter Drucker, the management guru, said, "Alliances are difficult precisely because there's no boss in them. They are a partnership, and partners are equal by definition. One cannot give orders to a partner. Hence, the secret of a successful alliance is to manage it as a marketing relationship. In a partnership, one considers what the other partner is a customer. And the first question is not what do we want to do? It is what are the partner's goals, the partner's objectives, what is value for the partner, and how does a partner work and operate? Once this is understood and accepted, the alliance will work." So to understand this churn in the Indo-Pacific, we are joined by four eminent personalities who are arguably the best minds in understanding the complexities of this partnership and alliance, and would look at this from not only India's point of view, but what it means to the Indo-Pacific region. Our first speaker of the day is Mr. Gurjeet Singh of the Indian Foreign Service, 1980 batch, who has recently retired as Indian ambassador to Germany. He has also been ambassador to Indonesia, the ASEAN, Timor-Leste, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. He has been a representative of India to the African Union, UNECA, and IGAD. He is also a deputy permanent representative of India to the UNEP and the UN Habitat. Currently, he is honorary professor of international relations studies at IIT Indore. Mr. Gurjeet Singh finished his schooling at Mayo College, Ajmer, and is a postgraduate of St. Xavier's College, Calcutta. He is a postgraduate in international studies from the School of International Studies, JNU. Welcome, Mr. Gurjeet Singh, and we look forward to hearing from you on this important subject. Our next speaker is Professor John Blaxland, who is a professor of international security and intelligence studies and former head of Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University. He holds a PhD in war studies. He is an MA in history and a BA honors too. He's a graduate of the Royal Thai Army Command and Staff College and the Royal Military College, Canberra. He's had extensive experience as an intelligence officer and has held important posts in the Australian government. He's a reputed military historian too. Welcome, Professor, to our CASA webinar, and we look forward to hearing your views from down under.
Thank you, General.
Our third speaker of the evening is Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, who is the Director General of the National Maritime Foundation. As a maritime practitioner, his experience stems from a 4-decade-long distinguished career in the executive branch of the Indian Navy. This includes a stint in the Antarctica, a 3-year deputation to the government of Mauritius, where he set up and commanded the Mauritius National Coast Guard, and 4 command appointments, including Principal Director of Naval Operations and command of the Indian Navy's sole aircraft carrier of the period at the INS Virat. He has been Chief of Staff of Western Naval Command and was, in his last naval appointment before retirement, the Commandant of the Indian Naval Academy at Erimala. Admiral Chauhan is on the visiting faculty of the higher command defense establishments of all 3 services. He has been advising the Indian government through his interaction with the integrated headquarters of the Ministry of Defense Navy, the Ministry of External Affairs, and the National Security Council Secretariat. He's been commended 3 times by the President of India for sustained distinguished service. The Admiral is a prolific writer on maritime and strategic issues and has published over 95 articles. Welcome, Admiral Chauhan, and we look forward to hearing your views. Our moderator for this discussion is Vice Admiral Anil Chopra, who was a former Commander-in-Chief of both the operational commands of the Indian Navy, the Western Naval Command and the Eastern Naval Command. He was also the former Director General of the Indian Coast Guard. He's commanded the Western Fleet and like Admiral Chauhan, commanded the aircraft carrier INS Virat. As Assistant Chief of Naval Staff Policy and Plans, earlier as Principal Director Naval Plans, he was extensively associated with the Navy's long-term force structure and financial planning. As member of the Apex Defense Acquisition Council for 3 years, he was involved in the ongoing evolution of the defense procurement procedure. He was also a member of the National Security Advisory Board and has been a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council of the US. Without further ado, I hand over to Admiral Chopra. Thank you, Admiral Chopra, for agreeing to conduct this webinar. Over to you.
Thank you, General. Greetings to everybody out there in cyberspace. Delighted, as always, to participate in a CASA webinar. The topic today is difficult. It is difficult to compare AUKUS with Quad. It's like comparing oranges with apples. One is a full-fledged military alliance, and the other is just an informal concert, if you wish, of democracies and like-minded nations. Of course, there is enough grist in the mill for everyone to analyze both, but it is not easy. But I'm sure our distinguished panelists will take it on and try and answer the question about both these particular groupings. Now, Quad and AUKUS, as you all know, are just two of the veritable jigsaw puzzle of groupings in the Indo-Pacific, of all shades and hues, from US-led military alliances to all sorts of bilaterals, trilaterals, and of course the quadrilateral. And it's almost becoming like the MFN, or most favored nation, which we used to see in trade and geoeconomics. No one quite knows now who is on whose side, and even amongst people on the same side, there are some bickerings which are bound to be there. So it's an interesting phase, and I think the topic is quite, we should have some fun analyzing Quad and AUKUS together. Now, without beating around the bush, all these groupings have come about because of China's aggressiveness, for those politically correct, assertiveness since 2008, thereabouts. And that has really catalyzed all these various helter-skelter groupings, which we have seen, and all sorts of arrangements, let's put it, in I think, a quest for security. As a challenger power, China has certainly added hugely to the insecurity in the Indo-Pacific, in a region which ever since the Vietnam War was very stable, and people were focused on economics and prosperity, and there was peace all around, Pax Americana and minutely, if you wish. But now, of course, everything changed, and the Chinese challenge has led to this overall feeling of insecurity for everybody, which has led to capacity building of the militaries, and a pushback against China, of course, but also a herding together, which is natural under these circumstances. And I think Quad and AUKUS in specific is certainly a response to China, unlike earlier alliances like the US has with Japan or with Korea, South Korea, which were a fallout of post-war alliances after World War II and the Korean War. Now, because of this insecurity, I think there's the typical Westphalian sort of urge to find a balance of power amongst nations. And what we are seeing today is fine-tuning of this balance of power. For those of us interested in history, the parallels of what happened in Europe when Napoleon got very aggressive, and the scrambling for various herdings and groupings. And that was also just one country at that time, unlike World War I and World War II, where there were 4 or 5 strong powers on either side. But it's interesting that in seeking this balance of power, we have come up with things like Quad and AUKUS. And the trouble with these sort of non-military alliances is their dependability. No one is quite sure whether people will fight if they are required to. There is an issue of dependability, unlike in the NATO or Warsaw Pact, where there are, concrete articles which call upon people to join in the fight, so to speak, if something occurs. Most of the alliances that we see now in the Indo-Pacific are of a very fluid and nature, with nothing really laid down, no commitments, no compulsions. And that is the first issue that I'd like to point out, that there's a dependability crisis. And I think AUKUS, in a way, stems from that dependability crisis. The second issue, which is there against the backdrop against which we must listen to these gentlemen, is this uncertainty which has come about because nobody is sure about the trajectories of the United States or China, the two principal players in the region. The United States, there are issues about its commitment. It's a paramount power, but by no stretch is it a hegemon in this region, a word used very loosely. Hegemon is someone who can just give a diktat and things are done, like the Roman Empire. But here, the US is paramount. It is not a hegemon. China, no one is even sure whether it's a great power just yet. But the US in recent years were more focused on West Asia. And during the Obama years, there was certainly a drift in the Indo-Pacific, which allowed the Chinese to build their wall of sand in the South China Sea. There are questions about US force levels, about its technological edge, about its internal polarization, and even about the competence of its military, stemming from not only Afghanistan, but by general information now available across the net. China, of course, has succeeded in its economy in the South China Sea and in its access area denial strategy. It's more or less created that cocoon it wanted in the South China Sea. And that's why AUKUS, as I'll come to, is very important. But where is China's trajectory? I think finally the narrative is fraying. The Chinese economy is questionable. And besides, China has already had very little soft power, and that is now being further diluted by COVID. And people are not really anymore interested in the hype or narrative pushed out by the CCP, at least amongst informed audiences. But let me tell you also that those of us who look at this closely, is the Chinese military is untested. It's untested, it lacks combat experience, a fact which militaries across the world, including China, are aware of. And China has dependencies and vulnerabilities. I don't have time to go into that, but China is not a powerful monolith which can't be challenged. And it has had its failure. The BRI, in my view, is a bit of a failure already. And it has huge problems with geography and circles and chains around it. So this dependability crisis and this uncertainty is leading to a volatile situation where everyone is hedging. Everyone is hedging between the US and China to various degrees. Australia, with AUKUS, has in a way quit hedging. And therefore, I think it might be interesting to listen to the professor, because certainly despite dissent in Australia, the very fact that it has gone into a clearly military alliance with the UK and the United States is a movement away from the strategic ambiguity and hedging which most powers seem to adopt in situations such as this. Now, before I hand over to the speakers, very quick recap of both Quad and AUKUS so that we have the framework within which they talk, and therefore they won't have to repeat some of the issues like this. Quad has had more or less three versions. Version 1.0 in 2007 phased out very fast. There were policy reversals in Australia, in Japan and India, and the US got into its frequent election frenzy, and then Obama just let it slide. And China then became very dominant in the South China Sea with new geographies. Trump's Quad was 2.0. He revived it in 2017. A lot of energy, a lot of calling out of China, Indo-Pac, come on, out of TPP, a lot of push given to meetings at various levels. And he certainly brought back a lot of energy into Quad. And Quad started getting more interoperable. Malabar started becoming more frequent, and otherwise there were alternatives to BRI and the supply chains which were talked about, and there was talk of Quad Plus. And then Biden 3.0 in 2021 is moved away clearly from any sort of alliance or military connotations. And now we have Quad, which is trying to constrain and maybe isolate Beijing in the larger global system, preventing it from dominating supply chains, manufacturing and infra, and therefore forcing it to compete and cooperate rather than to challenge. This is a long-term incremental strategy, and there are problems here with this Quad strategy because Beijing and the Son of Heaven in the Forbidden Palace could miscalculate, and therefore we have a problem where either Chinese miscalculation or Chinese hubris and its underestimation of both the United States and democracies in general may lead it to conduct itself in a fashion in which things like phone ops may not be enough. And then you come on to AUKUS. Clearly, it's part of the Anglosphere. And these are countries which have fought together since Gallipoli and are aware of each other's military strengths and weaknesses. And there is no ambiguity here. Unlike with India in the scheme of things can be very useful in Malacca, but there is strategic ambiguity and always the thrust for autonomy, and a clear disavowal of military alliance. So that was not there. And Japan's Article 9 also is something which would prevent it from going into something like AUKUS. So I think what they have done is now create an Anglo-spheric deterrent, which is actually very powerful. For those of us who, I would like to underline that what AUKUS gives the Indo-Pacific is a deterrent because it brings in SSNs within the confines of the first island chain. And thereby, they're not SSBNs. They are submarines which can be deployed for very long periods within the first island chain. And therefore, it's an actual military deterrent because it threatens Chinese shipping, Chinese fleets, Chinese warships. But this is 20 years away. And these facilities will be used by the UK and US submarines also. So they have actually pivoted now to the Western Pacific. And though there is dissent in Australia, and though there is transatlantic rumbling by France and others, that's where AUKUS is. But as someone said in the beginning, it could raise tensions. So maybe it's not the best thing. Who knows? So finally, AUKUS and Quad, more the merrier, or too many cooks spoil the broth. I leave it there. And with that, may I invite Ambassador Gurjeet Singh to take the floor. Ambassador.
Thank you, Admiral Chopra, and thank you, CASA, General Murthy, Mr. Mahadevan, for inviting me today with this rather eminent panel. So after digging up the pitch, you sent me as opening batsman. Now, I don't personally think that the situation is as confusing as it is made out to be. There is the Indo-Pacific, which is missing from the title of your theme today, but that is the reality in which AUKUS, Quad, everybody operates. And the Indo-Pacific is the one which gives India maximum space since World War II in this region. So to maintain Indo-Pacific and whatever goes with it is India's best interest. When the concept was called Asia Pacific, India was on the fringes or not in it. It is only with the East Asia Summit, when it was formed in 2005, that India got a firm root in what was otherwise and still is an ASEAN-centric region. Not only is the region ASEAN-centric, but almost all the organizations there. So the ASEAN +1 dialogue partnerships, the East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM+, Extended Maritime Forum, and the RCEP are all ASEAN-centric bodies. And everybody in the region, whether it is the Quad members, AUKUS members, or China, pay tribute to ASEAN Centrality. So long as there was no power tussle in the region and it was settled, there was no major issue, and the ASEAN way of doing things, which is essentially not a power concept, not a realist concept, but a liberal, value-based, be good concept, prevailed. It is only in 2012 or so when Chinese hegemonistic intent in the South China Sea becomes very visible that ASEAN gets a bit roiled. But it only takes them 5 years to adjust to China than to confront it. In this period of 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, is also the transition from Quad 1.0 to Quad 2.0. Now, it's not exactly congruent, but that's precisely. Now, Quad 1.0 was also a non-power concept. It looked largely at dealing with non-traditional threats, largely HADR. It did not think of confronting anybody except illegal migration, drug runners, piracy, and stuff. So ASEAN was comfortable with that because the Quad members would come to their aid. During the tsunami, countries like Indonesia understood that Australia, which they thought was their closest neighbor, was actually days away, and the Indian fleet from Andaman could reach you in hours. This realization dawned. Now, Quad 2.0 is a power concept, and this unsettles ASEAN. But ASEAN is not a power concept. And they say, oh my God, now what's happening? We are trying to negotiate with the Chinese. And remember, 2017 is when China actually starts discussing the code of conduct with ASEAN as a whole, having evaded it all these years. So as the ASEAN opens code of conduct talks with China, Quad 2.0 is born. And as these talks go on, Admiral, you called it Quad 3.0. I would prefer to call it Quad 2.1, the first summit, Quad 2.2, the second summit, because they are a continuity. Now, the difference between Quad 2.1 and Quad 2.0 and 1 and 2 is that Quad is becoming more and more ASEAN-centric or ASEAN-looking body. They're looking at ASEAN and saying, oh, we value your centrality, which Quad 2.0 really didn't bother about. But ASEAN is extremely concerned about Quad despite this homage to its centrality, because they realize that the Quad is not an ASEAN central body or institution or grouping or whatever you wish to call it. We may be disturbed by the lack of institutionalization of the Quad. ASEAN is not disturbed by that lack. They are just worried about the Quad. And they say, oh my God, what is this going to do to us? And how will China react? Now, then as Quad 2.2 is great homage to ASEAN centrality, it is preceded by AUKUS. Now, AUKUS is a pure power concept, whereas Quad 2.2 is trying to separate the power concept of defense collaboration, which was the original name of Quad was Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and leave it as a kind of a plurilateral coordination, whereas Quad 2.2 is focusing on functional, non-realist collaboration, challenging China through functional means like technology, vaccines, and stuff like that, not through military. This is basically pandering to the ASEAN, because we have to understand that all these ideas of the Indo-Pacific are basically to win the hearts and minds of ASEAN and the seas and region around it. That is where the battle needs to be joined. Now, AUKUS comes along and further disturbs this ASEAN neutrality, or what they call strategic autonomy of ASEAN. Now, Indonesia is most missed because Australia is among its best friends, and the US has no real friends, despite the defense secretary and the vice president going to ASEAN countries in August. And the UK is a strange character, trying to come back east of the Suez, but making a determined bid post-Brexit to be relevant in this region. Now, what have they done? They secured a dialogue partnership with ASEAN. They made an application to join the CPTPP, and they sent a carrier battle group to the region, during the visit of which AUKUS is announced. Now, this brings what Admiral called the Anglophone. But I don't agree with this Anglophone description, because after all, ANZUS was Anglophone. The Five Eyes is still Anglophone. I don't buy this Anglophone business. The problem in this is that it left the French out, and that is what says, oh, these guys are Anglophone. Now, leaving the French out was a clumsy action. The French are complaining about the submarine deal, but the French did almost the same thing to the Germans and the Koreans when they secured the Australian submarine deal. I was ambassador in Germany at that time. I now know how unhappy they were that the friendly French had turned unfriendly. So when you are making military deals, it is the same everywhere. So let's not get confused about strategy. Now, let me come quickly to what I think are the advantages or disadvantages of having both Quad and AUKUS. As Quad has separated the military aspects under Quad 2.2, AUKUS enhances the security aspects, and therefore I welcome it. It will involve two Quad partners along with the UK into having a technology upgrade, which you have explained very well, Admiral. Now, AUKUS also brings a firmness to Australia's policy in the Indo-Pacific. What happened after Quad 1.0 is now unlikely to happen, because with AUKUS, which is much more formal than Quad, Australia is firmly with the US. And if the US is firmly in the Quad, Australia will remain there too. But I believe that Australia sees the Quad and resultant consequences as also to its advantage. Thirdly, Australia lacks symmetry of intent and capabilities. But with the building of AUKUS and Australia's firm participation in Quad, you will see greater synergies in Australia's role in the region. And as Australia builds its strategic partnership with India, I believe that AUKUS and Quad in this case will become complementary. Next, there is an India-Australia-Indonesia trilateral, which acquires greater significance because it brings in an ASEAN country along with two Quad partners. This is going slowly, but it is going steadily. And we must not allow AUKUS or Quad or anything to distill this into a very weak subject. We must allow it to brew better. Similarly, there could be an India-Japan-Vietnam trilateral coming. But the problem with AUKUS is it has almost derailed the India-France-Australia trilateral. Now, to us, it is extremely important to have France as a partner. In some ways, France is a hedge against the US. In many ways, France is a more dependable partner than the US, particularly in the UN Security Council. They have become the go-to partner for us after the Russians have become Chinese poodles. Now, the problem with France is that they don't have any ideology, and they want you as a secure market for their defense products, as do the US. Now, somewhere down the line, this friction is going to come, and India will need to manage both our critical engagement with France and the Quad. We don't want to do an AUKUS on France. We can't afford to. But we need to understand, and others need to understand, that France is very important. You see, even NSA is in France right now, having important discussions. And France will remain a critical Indo-Pacific partner. Its presence is much more than the UK. And therefore, I believe we need to settle the Australia-French divisiveness so that we can revive the India, Australia, France trilateral. I still have time? Or you want me to stop?
I was just going to interrupt to request if
I'm
you
going
could
to
wrap
stop
up.
there.
No, it was
stop.
fantastic. Please go ahead. You could wrap up in a minute.
Well, I think that the crux of the issue is Asean centrality. These people are very conscious that China is the power in the region. And for all intents and purposes, the Quad and AUKUS are emerging because, as Admiral said, of Chinese hegemonistic intent and aggressiveness. Japan has a problem, the South Pacific has a problem, there's a Taiwan problem, India has a problem, the entire South China Sea is a problem, East China Sea is a problem. So China has roiled the waters much more than the Ring of Fire of the Pacific could ever do. You could resolve that with the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. But to deal with China, you will need much more intent and cohesive strategic policy coordination. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. And since you wound up by saying ASEAN as the crux of this, I'm going to take you up on that. Everyone is aware of ASEAN centrality and the homage that is paid to it by everyone in whatever they do. But may I ask you that in the current situation, as you said, the thing which was missing in the Indo-Pacific, in the title was the Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific, certainly for India and France, is far more than the Western Pacific and the Andaman Sea. There are issues in West Asia, there are issues of the coast of Africa. So I'm surprised that you brought it down to ASEAN centrality. But even if we limit it to the West Pacific, how much of ASEAN centrality, and this is a provocative question, is actually just say so in the diplomatic circuit, and how much does it really matter in the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific?
So let me clarify. Since our subject today did not cover the Western Indian Ocean, I did not do that. But it is not only India and France. Recently, India and Germany exercised outside Djibouti.
Yep.
India does it with the UK also. So it is not several of our partners exercise there, but this is for all of them. It is not Indo-Pacific policy. That is the only distinction.
Sure.
So France and India, and to an extent Japan, it is Indo-Pacific. For the US, it's not Indo-Pacific policy simply because that is CENTCOM and this is the different command. That is the only reason. Now coming to your question about ASEAN centrality. You know, I have always told ASEAN, even when I was there, which was in 2012, that simply saying centrality is no good. You have to be responsible for your region, which you show no responsibility. Instead of challenging China, you are adjusting to Chinese aggression. And Chinese aggression and the secret manner in which ASEAN is negotiating the code of conduct may give away the South China Sea to the Chinese. If the Chinese succeed in having no operation of UNCLOS, no operation of third parties, and stuff like that, which they demanded of ASEAN, it is something that will bother all of us of the Quad and beyond. Secondly, ASEAN keeps talking about UNCLOS and they keep asking us to talk about UNCLOS. But the Chinese don't talk about UNCLOS to the ASEAN. So ASEAN responsibility for their centrality has to be a phase which must come, without which ASEAN centrality will remain a simple thought. As I said, it will be there, but it is not a realist concept. So therefore, it will become an impediment to its friends to confront China.
Thank you. With that, let me move on to Professor Blaxland. And floor is yours, Professor. Many questions for you, I'm sure, from everyone.
Admiral, thank you for your very warm welcome. And may I say, it's a real challenge for me to follow up Ambassador Singh's profound remarks. He really did articulate the argument about whether or not AUKUS undermines the Quad or enhances it remarkably well. I would like to pick up one point from him before I go on to make my remarks. Firstly, he made the observation about AUKUS disturbing ASEAN strategic autonomy. And I think that's a very important observation, and the centrality and the sense of autonomy of ASEAN. My sense is that Australia, India, and others have for a long time gone along when we have not rocked the boat. We have let ASEAN continue with its rhetorical ambiguity. But I think ASEAN has become unsettled. Parts of ASEAN have become unsettled by Australia taking a stand. And it's perhaps a stand that ASEAN should have taken earlier over the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, over the Code of Conduct negotiations, and over the Arbitral Tribunal ruling of 2016. So the unwillingness of ASEAN to speak with one voice, or even with the majority voice, in support of international principles that would have reasserted ASEAN centrality, has, I think, strongly contributed to the incentives for countries like Australia and India to find alternative mechanisms, not to replace, but to complement ASEAN, because Australia remains a strong supporter of ASEAN, but we recognise its limitations and also do not wish to be constrained by those very limitations in the pursuit of our national interests. So thank you, Ambassador Singh. As I say, hard for me to follow such a top-notch performance. Can I just say, I'm going to, I think, address three broad points. Firstly, I want to address what is the AUKUS, what is Quad, and so what from an Australian perspective. And I think that will hopefully help explain whether my view on whether AUKUS undermines the Quad or enhances it. Firstly, AUKUS is, despite the opening hoopla of the event, of the declaration, with the Prime Minister and the President and the two Prime Ministers all simultaneously, on the screens together, which from a Canberra point of view was early in the morning. It was a surprise to everybody. It's really, in some respects, a little bit overblown, because it's really a technical agreement for nuclear propulsion and for the sharing of technology for additional manufacture and supply to Australia of precision-guided munitions, long-range, hypersonic and sophisticated, cutting-edge military technology. But it's not just that. And I guess that's where the hoopla comes in, because it builds on the points that Ambassador Singh touched on this, some of the things relating to that Anglo-spheric dimension, if you like, the history, the shared history that for Australia and the United States goes back to the signing of the ANZUS Treaty in 1951, but really goes back to 1941, a decade earlier, and 1942, when General Douglas MacArthur arrives from the Philippines to set up the American-led headquarters for the return offensive northwards in the Pacific War. This is the start of a completely different relationship Australia has with the United States and that Australia has with Britain. After the war, the five-power defence arrangement provides an ongoing tie with the United Kingdom that with which Australia has no formal alliance. There's no security guarantee between Australia and the United Kingdom. But we have the five-power defence arrangement, which covers our relationship with Malaysia and Singapore, two former colonies. And also, of course, and as Ambassador Singh, and I think Admiral, you touched on this as well, the Five Eyes connections. Australia is an intimate connected partner with the English-speaking countries, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And of course, the so-called ABCANs for armies, the five countries' armies have standardization agreements. There is the TCPs, the quadripartite cooperation standardization agreements. But interesting, these countries that were originally connected by culture and being English-speaking, a new world in the case of the United Kingdom, of the United States and Australia, new world offshoots from an Anglo-centric Europe, have become much more multicultural countries. They are not just the white Anglo countries they were 2 generations ago. Australia in 1967 abandoned the white Australia policy at about the time that the civil rights movement under Martin Luther King reached its pinnacle. And these countries have, despite ongoing tensions, Australia with its Aboriginal identity and reconciliation, these are ongoing issues in Australia, much like Black Lives Matter remains an issue in the United States. But these are countries that are now much more inclusive, much more cosmopolitan, much more accepting of non-Anglo contributors to society. So that is the context in which AUKUS has emerged. For the United States, we know, of course, we've seen this relative decline with the emergence of China that has seen great power contestation come back to centre stage. And that for us has been accentuated by the wolf warrior diplomacy, the exercise of sharp power, and the crystallizing of the realpolitik dimension of international relations that wasn't there 15 years ago when Australia was first engaging with India with Quad 1.0. The dimensions that emerged with Quad 1.0 coming out, as you mentioned, Ambassador, out of the Indian Ocean tsunami, where India responded, Australia responded, and then we met each other off the coast of Sumatra and realized, hey, why don't we cooperate more? You know, this is crazy. Finding we have so much in common, so many shared interests, but that we then were backed off. We backed off in part because we were intimidated by China. China was very angry at the prospect of a Quad 1.0, and the Prime Minister at the time, Kevin Rudd, basically said, oh, okay, all right, well, we don't want to cause offence, so we'll back out of the Quad, not realising that no matter what we did, it wasn't going to be enough to satisfy China on this. They wanted more than we were prepared to give. And that remains the case today. So moving back to this AUKUS formation, I want to just touch a bit on the post-Brexit UK. You know, Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973. It looked from Canberra's point of view and from Wellington in New Zealand that we were being abandoned by the British. We were still heavily trade dependent on the UK. Now we had diversified. We had a free trade agreement with Japan, and we were developing other trade relations across Asia. New Zealand, far less so, was much more heavily hit by the consequence of Britain's choice. So, but what we've seen is both Australia and New Zealand, we've actually prospered. It didn't really matter that much that the Brits moved away. That was okay. But as they seek to come back in the post-Brexit world, where they're looking to establish a global Britain, where they're looking to burnish their credentials with the United States in the Indo-Pacific, which is now the center of gravity, if you like, geostrategically for the United States. The emphasis, the utility of Australia to the United Kingdom has grown. But it is now one where it's a reciprocal one. They're seeing utility for Australia. But for Australia, we're now not seeing it as a subordinate relationship. It's now one of a partnership. When Britain joined the European Economic Community, it was the tail end of empire. Australia still had not fully, arguably, grown up. It hadn't quite realised it's, gone through puberty, if you like. It had still holding on to some of the apron strings of the UK. But that's long gone. That's more than half a century ago. And we are now a much more independently minded and more mature a state with its own organs of state. There's a parallel there with India, where having experienced, colonization at the hands of the British, there was an understandable and visceral reaction to Britain that I think has faded with time as Britain's power has waned, as its consequences, its tangible negative effects have waned. There is a sense that they're probably more welcome back in this neck of the woods now that it's more on a level pegging. It's not a superior subordinate relationship by any stretch of the imagination. They are here largely because we've invited them to be. And that's, I think, a very interesting dynamic at work.
Professor, sorry, can I just interrupt to wrap up and invite Admiral Chauhan to pull in a question once you wrap up, please?
Yes, sure. So just on what is the Quad? Well, the Quad is a four-way security dialogue. We talked about that before, but it has become more than 1.0. It's with 2.0 and 2.1 and 2.2, as Ambassador Singh has pointed out. It really is now much more than just about the security dimension. The virus options in response to the pandemic, the medical dimension, the IT, the information technology sharing. This is now about recognizing the geostrategic realities of shared geography and of overlapping interests and of our desire to collaboratively work to deter would-be aggression from a more assertive and more acerbic and more adversarial People's Republic of China. And so if I can move on to my third key point, so what from an Australian perspective? Well, I would contend that I'm not a fan of the Cold War 2.0 metaphor. I do not think it is helpful because we are not in the Cold War. It is very different to the Cold War of old. The dynamics are completely different, and that metaphor, I would contend, leads us to wrong examples to be drawn from the past. I think what we face now is a situation that I would describe as the 6 C's in the 1 C. The 1 C being the Great Lake, which is what the Indo-Pacific is dominated by, the Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, but the Southern and the Atlantics as well, okay? That's the 1 C. The 6 C's are the continuum of cooperation, competition, contestation, coercion, and conflict. Now, all of those are happening right now. We are seeing cyber attacks. We are seeing foreign interference. We are seeing assaults on the line of actual control in the Himalayas. We're seeing aggressive action in the Natuna Sea affecting Indonesia, across the so-called 9-dash line, across Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait, with the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, and etc. There's a lot of contestation and bordering on conflict happening already, including what people are calling grey zone operations, cyber operations. A lot of this is in relation to responding to the rise of China. I would contend that not all of this is negative. And there are some critics of AUKUS and of the Quad that see this as in a zero-sum, this is what hawks are saying, you're feeding the war agenda. I don't buy that. I find that a completely unhelpful way of looking at this. I see competition as healthy. I see contestation as not unhealthy, because this is way better than going kinetic. This is way better than crossing that threshold into actual overt war. And it is also, I believe, very helpful if we are to deter China from crossing that threshold itself. What would stop China from taking Taiwan, and once having taken Taiwan, make demands of Japan, make demands of the Philippines, and then make demands of the Andamans and of Australia's territories and beyond? Where do you draw the line? If we do not seek to deter, I would contend, and I think the evidence is mounting, that China will exploit the weakness. We are in a position where it is in our interests to collaborate, to deter, across a range of that 6 C's spectrum, from cooperation, competition, contestation, coercion, and conflict. And conflict, I'm thinking cyber in particular, the cyberspace, where there is a genuine conflict happening right now. Now, there was, as I started my remarks, referring to Ambassador Singh's excellent observation about ASEAN and its desire for centrality. I think it's really important that we work collaboratively to assuage the fears and concerns of our ASEAN neighbours and partners, and work collaboratively with them to reassure them of our desire for ASEAN to remain central, but at the same time, not allow them to constrain us in the pursuit of our interests, which are actually, in my view, also their interests, to push back. So at that point, I will pause now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor. Now, you did not say it in so many words, so I'm going to ask you, does Quad undermine or enhance? Does AUKUS undermine or enhance Quad? And as I can understand, of course, you do imply that it enhances, and all such collaboration is, of course, there for deterrence. So the only question that I really have for you is the degree of dissent in Australia regarding AUKUS. We've all been reading articles about people who are exercised about the shipbuilding industry, about the nuclearization, the activists, and so on. And of course, any election in a democracy can bring about a reversal of policy. Not, of course, that it can reverse AUKUS, but it might determine the progress of AUKUS. So having observed these things over the years, how stable would AUKUS be in the years to come in the light of possible dissent within Australian society, and also due to any political turbulence?
Excellent question, Admiral. And look, I guess my remarks were making the point that there is, and you pointed this out, in terms of the direct, blunt answer to your question, does AUKUS undermine the Quad or enhance it? I would contend that they are complementary. They are not the same. They serve different functions, but they are complementary. And there's some very interesting observations. In Australian politics, there are a number of political parties. On the right-hand spectrum, there is the National Party, which used to be the Country Party or the Farmers' Party, aligned with the Liberal Party, that's the conservative side of politics. The left or centre-left has been the Labor Party, which was the Workers' Industrial Party. And then what's emerged in recent years is the Greens. And the Greens have taken a position which is much more than just about the environment. They have taken a view about geopolitics that is more about isolation and neutrality. And this is a view that people in the Labor Party and in the coalition view as naive and dangerous, because it is about not funding the military, not bolstering deterrence, and basically, taking a view that Australia should become more of a porcupine, withdraw into itself more, and avoid conflict and just basically hunker down. I would contend that that is not a tenable, sustainable path into the long-term future. It may be tenable for a few years, but not for long. And it's not because Australia is enormously invested in its relationship with the United States. Australia technologically is very much connected and interoperable with the United States. It is as effective and as powerful on the world stage as a middle power, in large part because of the ability to leverage its connections, its networks, its capabilities from those it draws from the United States. So there is dissent. There is no question there is dissent. It is, in my view, part of the electorate that is highly unlikely ever to gain a majority in politics. And there is nonetheless, so that's on the dissent front. So I think we can park that as it's a concern, it's a legitimate one. It's one that I think the Australian body politic is mindful of. Both the centre, the Labor Party and the Conservatives are mindful of it, but are not overly fearful of it, because it is considered essentially still relatively marginal. And also, as the great power contestation gets greater, the challenges become more sharply defined. One of the things that I would argue, and I've written about this in what I've called a geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia, looking at the strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats for Australia, is that when we distill that down, to my mind, it comes to three things. We have great power contestation, we have looming environmental catastrophe, and we have a spectrum of governance challenges: terrorism, criminal gangs, people smuggling, prospects of the breakdown of law and order. All of those combine to generate a dark overlapping space. Now, the Greens' agenda tends to focus on the environment and not so much on the governance or great power contestation. My sense is most of the Australian public get that it's all three. It's not one or the other or the other. All three are engaged.
Professor. I'll have to stop you there in the interest of time, but thank you for that response. And with that, let me hand over to my friend Bilu Chauhan and what he has to say today. All yours, Admiral Chauhan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chops. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Professor Blaxland. And of course, thank you to CASA. I think I'm going to be playing a bit of an outlier, and I also wanted to address this particular topic head on. Before we can do that, and without taking anything away from the comments of my illustrious predecessors, I want to ask a simple question of everybody. What exactly do you mean by security? And if you're muddled about this, and if you're in a position where you've taken an IR stand, you're a realist, and then you have mildly disguised derision for other schools of international relations, then I think that we are going to end up with bias predisposing our argument. So obviously I'm a realist, but I'm also mindful of the benefits and the advantages of value-based liberal orders. And I'm also filled with great disquiet by the ascendance or the toppling of all other schools by any one given school, including that of the realists. So let me return to my question about what then is regional security. And could we and should we so happily, so in my mind, naively segregate military security from regional overall security? Does not one feed into the other? Where does military security actually fit? And I think that military security fits as an insurance and an assurance mechanism for the pursuit of the strategies that have been evolved by the region, by its players, by individuals, even by marginally crazies, for the pursuit of their, or the attainment of their geo-economic objectives. And that is where the militaries fit. And therefore, structures involving militaries fit there, and ought not to, in my mind, ought not to be confused and placed at a level higher than they are. They are like diplomacy. They are an instrument of foreign policy. Diplomacy and the military are neither exclusive to one another, nor ought they to be. So I think that if we approach the problem from this perspective, we may end up with different answers. The first is, do you have, at least from the top of your head, each person has outlined the disadvantages and the advantages of AUKUS. Let me do the same. Let me rattle off maybe 10 to a dozen disadvantages and perhaps a marginally lesser number of advantages. So AUKUS, at the very top of our strategic value thinking, nations, since nation states tend to balance continuously between two contradictory predilections. One of them is national interest. The other is international trust. And these militate against one another. And very frequently, we end up at a given point in time, often pontificating about what ASEAN ought to or ought not to do, completely divorcing ourselves from the reality of what we ourselves may or may not have done at a point when it was necessary for us to confront or to follow the dictum that the only condition for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And we did very little. So I think it's very hard for me to subscribe to a view that actually moralizes to one other grouping without having to look at oneself. Therefore, what exactly are the, against that backdrop, let me say what exactly I feel are the disadvantages of AUKUS. The first of them is that it undermines the value and worth of a sovereign promise. The fact that France did the same thing to Germany, or that Australia has done what it has to France, it's neither here nor there. We're not into the fallacy of, you did it and therefore I can do it. So Hugh Quaker, if I'm not wrong, is the actual fallacy, but that's not relevant. What is relevant is that you are seeking, this creation has sought to undermine the value, the worth, and the credibility of one sovereign promise to another. And it doesn't matter what the promise was and who won or who lost. When sovereign promises are violated on the basis of national interest, and that too military national interest, and that too dubious military national interest, then I think that we have something to think about. The second is that the AUKUS causes fractures and has caused a fracture in the companionship of democracies, if I might borrow a term or two from literature. The third is that it rebuffs the European Union without any real reason or without any real gain, and it diminishes the relevance of both the E3 groupings, that is the old E3 grouping involving the UK when it was a member of the EU, and France and Germany, and the new E3 UK where the UK is replaced by Italy. It diminishes the Quad by marginalizing and removing India and Japan from centrality. It offers Australia no tangible military benefit for at least a period of 2 decades, and that too, I think, is highly optimistic, because having been a long time admirer of the Australian industry and the Australian approach, I'm also a long time a person who's for long been dismayed by the direction that Australia has often taken in this regard in terms of building its capacities and its capabilities. So I think that Australia is going to be ending up with no submarines whatsoever. It forces a binary. It forces a binary between China and the USA completely, once again, unnecessarily. It alienates France. Everybody has said that that's not a good thing, and I'd like to emphasize that. It weakens plurilateral structures that are already existing, such as the IONS and the WPNS and the ADMM plus, instead of strengthening them. It is just seductive in the fact that anytime you create a new thing, it looks like a great idea. And then you go over and then some other bozos who are now 11 and 12 years old will come onto these sorts of panels as we are, and then probably drag our thoughts over the coals and drag us over the coals, and quite justifiably, I might say. It seriously fractures the India, France, Australia trilateral. The ambassador has already made mention of it, but he also emphasized the fact that the India, Australia, Indonesia trilateral is buttressed. Yes, but as you say that one is a slow one, it ought to have been a fast one. And that's precisely my point, that for a long period of time, the Indian foreign policy is ignoring and lack of vigor in its dealing with Indonesia is now getting up and biting it in the Netherlands, in the nether regions. So it seriously fractures the India, France, Australia trilateral. It pushes Russia and China closer together, which need not have been done. The UK is by no stretch of imagination either is or is going to be any global power within the 30-year period that we're talking about between this and the submarine. And therefore, India's obsession with getting approval ratings from the UK is baffling to me. And finally, I'd say that as Professor Blaxland has already mentioned, it diminishes the importance of the Five Eyes grouping of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and the USA. What I mean by that is that any grouping that you already created is now pushed into the sidelines by this new boy. And we are now having to deal and talk about the new boy in relation to the whole region. What is the whole region represented by? I think it is represented by the Quad. So what are the advantages of the AUKUS? Well, of course, it sends a strong signal to China. Of course, it could be the embryo of a future military construct for the Indo-Pacific. I deeply disagree that either the Quad or the AUKUS is an alliance. Neither of them is an alliance. The whole concept of alliance is really antediluvian. It should have been left behind with the Cold War constructs that Professor John Blaxland says that we are no longer in, and yet we use the currency of those terms fairly loosely. It signals the USA's intent to remain invested in the region, which is a really good thing. It offers a very strong basis for the India-France bilateral relationship. And therefore, India-France bilateral relationship is being pushed forward. Is that good for India? Yes. Is it good for the Quad? I'm not so sure. Is it good for the region? Well, yes and no, insofar as bilateral relations are good or bad for any region. It offers legitimacy to the UK within the Indo-Pacific, and that's one of its big advantages, to the UK at least. Most important of all, it does free the Quad to concentrate upon those very points of somewhat derisive dismissal that I've been hearing, which is it enables the Quad to concentrate upon integrative regional projects. Let me try and explain this. The only way you will be able to handle China is not by confronting China militarily in either the South China Sea or elsewhere. The only way you'll be able to handle China is for you to knit this region, this Indo-Pacific region, in so tightly that there are no fissures or cracks through which China can make strategic entries. And that requires you to pay attention to the region as equals within the Quad construct. I'm limiting myself, obviously, to the Quad. So it frees the Quad to concentrate upon this integrative, these regional projects that integrate. And it allows India to leverage the Quad's economic potential to hit its own target of becoming a $5 trillion economy. So from India's perspective, is this all a good thing? Yes, it is a good thing. From the region's perspective, is it a good thing? Much less clear that it is a good thing. From the Quad's perspective, I think it is not a good thing at all. I stop there because I think that they're bound to be.
Admiral, I was just going to say those fireworks, definitely the Australian Prime Minister is going to be worried if you come on shore. I could see Professor Blaxland and everybody wondering where this nuclear missile is going. But anyway, Admiral Chopra, I will leave it to you to take it with another question.
Well, for a moment, I thought it might be difficult to stop that flow, but Bilu, I think, did it himself, which is remarkable. But let me ask you one question in all seriousness, which is your comments on alliances. Now, you made a point that military alliances no longer exist in the traditional Cold War fashion or earlier, but I'd like to dispute that. There are two alliances, certainly in the Indo-Pacific, the one the US has with Japan and the other that it has with the Republic of Korea, which clearly lays down that the US will come to the military help of either of these two countries if they are attacked. Now that is an actual military alliance. And the AUKUS, while it doesn't have any articles about coming to each other's aid, is clearly lays down that it is a military pact, which is going to enhance building of submarines, lays down cyber, lays down AI, lays down quantum, it lays down everything else for a very specific military purpose. So it is clearly an alliance. So would you like to sort of expand on what you mean when you say that there are no longer any alliances in the world of today?
Yeah, I'm probably unable to make my point, was unable to make my point clearly enough, so thank you for the opportunity to rectify that. It is not my contention that there are no existing alliances. It is my contention that the age of entering into new alliances is now over. We are now replacing alliances all across the board by strategic partnerships. So we have a whole hierarchy of strategic partnerships. You have a strategic partnership, you have a comprehensive strategic partnership, you have a global comprehensive strategic partnership. And the fact is that these partnerships are not based upon military commitments of one or another, but on the larger the number of policy fields, the more critical is the strategic partnership. And therefore, AUKUS, if you confine AUKUS to the area of military production of submarines and the enhancement of AI, etc., first of all, that itself is a bit of a stretch because AUKUS is correct for the requirement for production of submarines and the transfer of technology relating to that. But other factors of technology are well within the ambit of the Quad.
Okay, thank you for that. But as a corollary, and I'll give you another opportunity to clarify yourself, that you are saying that it's an era of partnerships, alignments, as opposed to, formal alliances, and you're correct. But is there not a danger that all this sphere of comprehensive strategic partnerships, this sphere of 2+2 dialogues with all and sundry, the sphere of trilaterals between all sorts of combinations, is there not a danger of all this becoming a talk shop at first, and therefore mitigating against what you started with, is the realist military issue?
Yes, clearly there is that danger, clearly, but that danger exists even within the established alliance structures of the Second World War onwards, where alliance partners, having signed treaty commitments, have reneged whenever they feel that it is not in their interest to enter into somebody else's war. And the problem with the alliance is just that it can drag you in quite unwillingly into somebody else's, sort of pursuit of that country's national interest or its perceived threat to that country's national interest. That's really the problem with the whole alliance structure. And it is working, as you've seen for yourself, in too many cases.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that comment. And with that, let me throw the floor open to the audience. There are some questions in the chat box or in the question answer box. I think the first one is from Rishi Athreya for Professor Blaxland mentions that the UK is supposedly welcome back as a non-colonial power. The UK is effectively present in the Indo-Pacific only due to the dominions. Australia, along with USA, New Zealand, and France, is part of the Southern Quad. How will AUKUS affect the Southern Quad? For you, Professor.
Yes, thank you. And look, I appreciate Admiral Chopra, your question. And look, Australia has not handled the relationship with France very well, but it's not all one-sided. France really was pretty cavalier in its approach towards Australia with the submarine deal. Once it had it secured, it felt it was able to throw its weight around and be pretty casual in response to Australian pleas for more urgent, more thrifty responses, and it didn't happen. Now, France remains a Indo-Pacific power. It's got physical presence in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It remains, we have the France, Australia, New Zealand arrangements. We have ongoing interests in collaborating with France in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean especially. And it is in our interests to make the relationship with France work. So if India can help us do that, that would be good. I recognise Australia has not handled that well. We have arguably blown it. And I do think, though, that President Macron has taken it a bit too far. And there's no credit around at the moment for how this has been handled, largely by either side. But it remains in the interests of Australia and France to collaborate. I would contend it remains in the interests of India for France to collaborate not only with India, but with Australia, and for us to find a workable way to get past the challenges we've experienced, to maybe, and there's going to have to be some creative engagement opportunities explored. But there's no question that this is a setback in terms of the engagement with France in the region, but it's not, I believe, an insurmountable one. But France does need to get over it. Australia does also need to act with some more humility and offer some olive branches. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Then there are a series of questions on deterrence from Rumail Dahya. He asked, what will it take to deter China? And then he asks, is AUKUS strong and determined enough to deter China? And how soon is Quad expected to organize capabilities to be able to deter China? Well, I leave it to all the panelists who may want to comment on this. It's about deterrence, it's about Quad, it's about AUKUS. So in the same order.
I think Professor Blaxland can take the AUKUS part of it, and Ambassador could come in with whether Quad is ready with the capabilities.
So AUKUS on its own can't deter, and not sufficiently and not fast enough. But what AUKUS does is it sends a very loud signal, a demonstration of resolve for the United States to remain engaged and for Britain to engage in a fresh way, and to accelerate domestic production in Australia of munitions and advanced missile technology, and to explore other opportunities for collaboration on AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, precision-guided munitions, as well as nuclear propulsion. They are all sending a signal to Beijing that what you are doing to us is generating a reaction. And the more you do it, the more we will react. We are not going to back down. We are not, your strategy is backfiring. So if you want to change reaction, change the way you're approaching us. Thanks.
Ambassador.
Thank you. So I would first like to react to something that Admiral Chauhan said. Sir, every strategic partnership does not an alliance make. India and ASEAN are strategic partners. India and Japan add an adjective to the strategic partnership almost every 3 years. We are not allies. But as Admiral Chopra said, Japan and Korea are allies of the US. Where India is concerned, the word alliance is imperative because in the US system, you become eligible for certain weapons exports if you are classified as an ally. And the term is in that US system. And India is classified as I think a non-NATO ally or something. And that makes us eligible for certain kind of weaponry which other countries are not eligible to. So the word alliance has a different meaning now, which is more perhaps not realist or anything anymore. It is simply a legal way of dealing with partners. Now coming to the issue of how or when Quad will be ready. What Quad is up against is a multitude of issues on which, let us say, ASEAN has been weaned away, and many countries in the region will be weaned away. Since the pandemic began, ASEAN and China are mutually the biggest trading partners. China has huge FDI growing in ASEAN, though it is still number 3, it is growing rapidly. It has a large amount of BRI infrastructure projects. I think at last count, 55 BRI projects in ASEAN countries, still second to Japan, but not for long. So when you are dealing with countries like groupings like ASEAN, you are not dealing only with the military issue. That is why Quad has sort of set it aside. We have to challenge China in every sphere by offering more trade opportunities, more resilient supply chains, more infrastructure, more vaccines, more and better technology to challenge 5G of China. I mean, the battle is much bigger now than only on the seas. And that is why Quad 2.2 has taken this battle to the ASEAN mind and beyond. It would take you about 10 years if you get it all right. The problems come because within the Quad, procurement systems are not the same. If India and Japan decide to do one project, you have so many different procurement systems involved, it's impossible to use government money from both countries to do the same project. There is the Japan, Australia, US trilateral for infrastructure in Southeast Asia. Not taken off except for Papua New Guinea. But there are problems in these. But China has the advantage that BRI overcomes every domestic problem. Whereas Quad will have to first deal with these internal issues, set up complementarity. Now there is the SCRI, Supply Chain Resilience Initiative between Japan, Australia, and India. Now this is going to work, but I still think Australia and India need to work out complementarity. Japan has complementarity with India and Australia. But Australia is today looking at India for economic and beyond for strategic reasons. When it was only for economic reasons, India was not important. So the Quad has taken these collaborative efforts to steps beyond, but I would say you will need a decade to put things in order.
Thank you. Yeah, Admiral Chan.
Admiral Chauhan, while you are addressing that point, the next question also would be relevant, where Ravi Bhatia asks, are we not failing to recognize that China sees the so-called strategic ambiguity as a sign of weakness or a lack of real commitment? Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me address the first question about what will it take to deter China. It will take a first-rate navy. That is number one. Does that navy have to fly a single national flag? That is not necessary. But it needs to have credibility in every part. That means if you've got 4 countries in the Quad, they need to concentrate upon their navies. With great and deep respect, I would like to disagree that this is no longer about the seas. This is actually only about the seas. And even the vaccine diplomacies, et cetera, that have been spoken about, the logistic and the supply chain resilience initiatives, these are all either going to be developed around ports and the hinterland that ports serve through port-led development, or they're not going to work. So what is going to deter China in the first instance, as I said, is going to be first-rate navies of China, of India, of Australia, of Japan, and the USA that are committed to this region, and they signal resolve. Because finally, resolve is what deters, and if deterrence fails, then of course we are into a completely different discussion. Insofar as whether China perceives strategic ambiguity as a weakness, it is not my case that we should not be investing in military power. It is my case that military power is not the only element, that is sea power, is not the only element of maritime power that we should be investing in. We should be investing in manners in which best practices are exchanged and adopted in terms of the carriage of goods. We currently in India have a completely ludicrous situation where we have less than 7% of our exports and imports being carried on Indian flag bottoms. We are therefore stuck with the ramifications of this. Australia is no better, and nor is the USA. Therefore, it provides us with opportunity. And as these opportunities manifest themselves, China will cease to see these as strategic weaknesses and recognize them as strategic strengths, simply because that's how China's structure is. It recognizes things. It doesn't get distracted by the short term or the today factor. Thank you.
Admiral
Okay,
Chopra, can we extend this, although the time is up? With the permission of the speakers, can we extend it by another 10-15 minutes for a few more
Well, we
questions?
only have 2 more questions, which I can see typed in. Let me ask both of them. One is from Rumail Dahya again. Can any partnership or alliance work optimally if every member is merely wanting to draw from it instead of also contributing to it? Every member of Quad is into the partnership for their specific reason, but the main one is China wanting to hurt the interests of each one of them. Who would like to take this on? I think one of you should take it on, whichever. Would you, Admiral John?
Yeah, I would very much like to say that this is a fact, this is a statement at the which taken at its superficial level, nobody can disagree with. However, it implies that nations are entering into the Quad, for example, solely with the purpose of extracting what they can from the Quad without contributing, and that is actually untrue. It is a misperception, if at all it exists. India is a very good example, as is Australia, as is China. Each of these countries, as is the USA, are contributing into the Quad. And that's how you're getting these. Everybody recognizes the fact that China, for instance, has a BRI that is functioning. I entirely agree with Admiral Chopra's opening comment that the BRI is nowhere near as successful as its spin meisters are making it out to be, that there is significant pushback which is going on as the ramifications of the BRI become more and more evident, and we make them more and more evident, we being those countries that are opposed to a rules-based order where the rules are formulated in Beijing. So each country which is involved in the partnership of the Quad is certainly contributing and not merely extracting. That, I think, is a flat rejection of that particular implication, if at all the implication was there. If it wasn't, then I apologize.
Okay. The other 2 questions are more geo-economic in nature and could open another discussion altogether with TTP and RCEP. So I think it's now 11:31. Maybe we should wind up the question and answer session. I just have a few points in my closing comments. And first of all, I think the score is 2.5:1 as far as AUKUS and Quad undermining or enhancing is concerned. 2 of the speakers were clearly of the view that it would enhance the efforts of the Quad. Pradeep Chauhan was not so sure. He was, felt it was different for different things. But be that as it may, the fact is that Australia has upped the ante in the Indo-Pacific by taking a clear stand. And it is now going to be, that is going to push on ASEAN, maybe also on India, and maybe also on Japan, all of whom have felt Chinese pressure, but have been reluctant to some degree, for good reason, to starkly come out as Australia has. And in India's case, it has taken very strong anti-Chinese stands in both the BRI, the RCEP, the Ladakh frontier. And so India has not been hesitant to take a stand against China, but its articulation has been sort of moderate and for good reason, which all understand. So is it for Japan. But Australia has now come out clearly. I think that point about strategic ambiguity, we could talk about some other day at length. The fact is that a regime such as the authoritarian regime in China does not understand strategic ambiguity, perhaps as well as many of us do. And it could be taken as a form of weakness and may deter, may reduce the level of deterrence. I think there are 2 or 3 other things which I could say at end, but I'd like to say just one, that we are still talking about the middle future, the distant future, taking for granted a Chinese power for granted. And I think that is that we all believe the Chinese narrative. There's nobody who seems to doubt the Chinese narrative, that it will be the world's largest power in 25 to 49. I have very serious doubts about that. Some others do. But therefore, when we talk about the middle future, I think we should pay attention to some of the issues which China may confront in the very near future, including its economic strength. And I think the Chinese future is linked to Xi Jinping's future to a very large degree. And therefore, the Congress in 2022 may be a turning point which may upend everything in the Indo-Pacific if China reverts to its progress as taken forward by earlier leaders in China. And of course, there are a lot of other pressures on nation states now emanating from a more postmodern sort of climate, and including limits of sovereignty in a world where everything is decided centrally. I'd like to end by just saying the problem, as I see it at least, remains just so, is the dependability of all these alliances, alignments, partnerships, the dependability. And I think everything else apart, I think the US, UK, and Australia feel that AUKUS between the 3 of them is a dependable sort of thing, rather than the many other alliances which are there in this part of the region. And as Bilu said, even alliances, you need not venture into somebody else's war if you so choose not to. So I would also agree that in the very broad sense, perhaps AUKUS enhances or contributes or complements the efforts of Quad in a different direction. And maybe it's best for the Indo-Pacific to get specific in certain areas, at least. With that, thank you, and over to Gautam again.
Thank you very much, all the panelists. This has been a most wonderful discussion. And if I may just add a word, one of our respected defense reporters has mentioned yesterday that there is a possibility of the strong moves towards getting India, Japan, and South Korea into the Five Eyes Alliance. Now, where that will pitch us and how closely that will get us towards AUKUS and how it will strengthen Quad is to be seen. I think we'll need another webinar for that as that story develops. But thank you all very much. Thank you, Ambassador Gurjeet Singh. Thank you, Professor Blaxland, for taking out your time from way down under. Thank you very much, Bilu, my friend and coursemate, and Anil, too, my friend and coursemate, for moderating this discussion. And above all, I'd like to thank Team CASA, Mr. Mahadevan Shankar, and Barnali for our efforts in putting this together. Thank you all the participants for attending this webinar, taking out your time on a Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon to attend this. Thank you all. Good day, good luck, and Jai Hind.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.